Hello people of the internet. Well, hopefully I've got an interesting video for you today, and that is basically trying different water-based, watercolour, aqua markers and seeing whether they blend. Now there's been a couple of times when I've done some swatching videos where I have any water-based markers that I generally swatch. I do swatch on watercolour paper to see whether they blend out with water, because the nature of water-based pens is that they are water-based and generally would blend out in some way with water. But there is a difference between watercolour pens and water-based pens, isn't there? I don't know. Let's try. So what I'm going to do is move all this out of the way and then show you what I'm going to do. Okay, so you've probably seen these everywhere. You can get them badged as whatever these are, Dapsum, Creative Peak, Castle Arts. They're all pretty much the same thing. They're basically called watercolour brush pens. They do have a brush type nib or tip, and they are labelled watercolour, which would imply they make a beautiful watercolour effect. So they are target number one. The next one I'm actually going to test is these pens. Now these are very old. They came out, I've had them for a long time, 10 years maybe. And these was actually, this one's by Aqua, the blue one, and the green one is by Pentel. And they were called Aqua Watercolour System Colour Sketch Brush. And they've actually got pigment numbers on them, Persian blue in the case of this one, and these were labelled at the time that I bought them as by Kuretake. Wow, Kuretake before Kuretake was, you know, big Kuretake, and they was labelled as watercolour paint in pens, so that was called watercolour pens. So they're gonna be in the mix. The next thing that I'm going to bring into the mix is these, which I have swatched out on my channel, which are water-based brush markers. And I'm going to take out the colour that I'm going to use right now. I was actually going to do a spectrum of all different colours, but I've decided to use the same, roughly the same colour across everything, so that we can see how the similar pigments move, because sometimes other pigments move better than the other, or dyes move different to others. So they're the next one on the list. Let me just get one of these out. A bluey one of these. Looks like that one. And then I can get all these boxes out of the way. Make room on my desk. Okay, so I've got a little pen thing here. So I've put the brush marker in. I've put the Aqua in. I've put the in, and then so next we're going to have a Spectrum Noir Aqua marker. So these, it says 9 water-based colours, 3 in 1 for an instant colour scheme, and these are water-based aqua markers. So which is the one with the blue in it? Aqua, blue or marine, so we want the warm primary. So this one, that's got that blue in it. Oh, I bet that doesn't fit in me. It doesn't fit in my pen thing, but it will do. Then the next one we're going to test is Tombow, good old Tombow. I have a spectrum of those. I've already taken the blue one out there that I'm going to use. So that's Tombow dual tip brush pens. Most of these I've had for a long time. I've recently got some more colours. And I didn't think that I'd be able to have distress markers in the equation, because I didn't think I had any. But I have one that I was given as a sample when they first came out. So there he goes. He goes in the little pot. Okay, so that's the brush tip pens I'm going to use. And the next ones I'm going to try are these kiddie felt pens that are actually called washable watercolour pen. Now, I'm starting to think that a lot of companies are starting to use the phrase watercolour when they mean water-based, but hey, it says watercolour in it, so let's see if they will blend. So we go with that one, or that one. I'll go with that one actually. That one. I'm going to put them in my little tray over here. Okay, so that's those. Next we're going to look at good old Crayola super tips, which we know are water based, and a lot of people blend them out. So let's grab one of those, nice blue one. Next we're going to try one from my lovely tin of Tripless 323 colour markers. So there's one of those, another fibre tip type pen, water based. And then we're getting down to the real old stuff that I have. I have these Pentel Arts Studio fibre tip pens. That one, I'm guessing. These are really old. And then Norris Club. Now the prices of these pens that I'm taking out vary between £4 and, I didn't say £200, because a set of the Tombos are about £200. And then finally, because I had one more space and I didn't know what to do, I'm going to use a Papermate Flare. So that is a flare, the Papermate Flare. It's another water-based marker, and I just wanted to have the space filled. Now, every time I have done a swatch where I've used water-based pens, I have used watercolour paper, A4 watercolour paper. This paper is 190 grams, acid free, but it does go through the printer, and I always use watercolour paper. Some people leave comments that my paper isn't watercolour. So for this test I have dug out 2 old watercolour pads of my own. This is Winsor & Newton Cotman watercolour paper, £140, 300 GSM, cold pressed. And then this is the Langton by Daly Rowney. This is £140, 300 GSM, the same. I don't know if it's cold pressed. Hold on. Yeah, probably. But they're both roughly the same paper. So I'm going to use the Cotman one. But they are, and I've left it in the pad. My pad got torn, by the way, over the years. Left it in the pad so people can see that it is watercolour paper. I'm going to take it out now. It's still stuck at the top there. You can see, really thick, creamy watercolour paper. So, what I have done, let's zoom you in a bit now, is I have basically, at the top here we're going to have a control section where I'm going to do a piece of blob of watercolour paint there, so we can see how actual true watercolour works on watercolour paper. And here I'm going to do a permanent marker, and for the permanent marker, or a waterproof marker, I'm going to use a Faber-Castell Pitt Artist pen, which is Indian ink, waterproof, maximum light fastness, rah rah rah. Now I have the small or the big brush, and I'm using the big brush just because it's easier to get out of the box. And then obviously I'm going to do all the brush pens this side, and we're going to do, now I have to be careful here because I have a cup of water here, and a cup of tea, and I'm really hoping that I don't get them mixed up. So let's have a swig of tea and put it out the way, and then move the water over there. I have a water brush which is filled with water already, and I have a Perfect Pearls paintbrush, which has been used but has got the cover on it still. Don't know why. There we go. Right, so Perfect Pearls, wet that up. I've got some tissue as well here so we can clean off the brush, kitchen towel, and move that to one side. So this is a Zig water brush pen with water in it. There's the water. Let's just hoover that up and clean the brush because it's a bit. There we go. And this. Right, so now we can zoom you in and start at the very beginning with the water brush pen. So this is the, what they're calling real brush pens, and have a you know, a real brush kind of nib. So goes quite down quite nicely. I'll do one up, one down for everyone so everyone gets the same. And then we're going to get the water brush, make sure it's nice and wet, and blend out. Now it does actually blend out quite nicely. Lovely. So now we're going to do the old Pentel version of that pen, or the ArtJourney one, which is quite old. Again, these are like water brushes but filled with watercolour paint. Very vivid colour. Oh, the other thing I was going to do is I was going to put a blob down and let it dry. See what happens after it's dried. So we'll do that and come back to that one at the end. Let's brush this one out. Clean my brush off. This is very soluble. It's just like pure watercolour paint. Oh, I forgot to do my controls. Let's do a bit to dry there as well, so we can come back to it. And in the meantime, I will do my controls. So I have a watercolour. Zoom you out just a tiny little bit for the control. The watercolour pad here, the watercolour paint. That's how watercolour paint is reacting on this watercolour paper. And then this is the Faber-Castell waterproof pen. Let's do a blob of that. Clean the brush. So the brush is running clear. And then, oh, that's really interesting, isn't it? That's a permanent ink pen. A waterproof ink pen. Look how lovely that blends out. Now you know why I used a waterproof ink pen as my control. Let's get you down to these. Right, ooh, brush tip is next. So they look like, probably don't need to be in that much, do we? They look like this. Here's brush tip one end, fine line at the other. Lays down very nicely. Make sure my brush is coming through clean. Pigment does move a little bit, but probably just a loose pigment that's sitting on the paper, because it's the permanent pen moved probably a little bit better than that. Okay, next one is the Spectrum Noir Aqua marker, and I have the triple one, so I'm going to use the blue from the warm section. Did I do up and down? Can't remember. Make sure my pen is clean and blend it out. That's really interesting. Does second time round a bit more pigment comes away. Start to see the difference. Okay, now we're going to do Tombow dual tip marker. So they look like this. They have a fine tip one end, a brush marker the other. One up, one down. That's what we said, didn't we? We only did one up on the other one. Make sure the pen's clean so we don't get any water brush is clean so we don't get any taint. And blend out the Tombow. The Tombow blends out really well. Just the whole thing disappears. And while we're letting that dry, I'm going to put a hoo-hoo down for revisiting once it's dry, and Spectrum Noir down for revisiting once it's dry, and now Tombow down for revisiting once it's dry. So now we go on to the Tim Holtz Distress Marker, Mermaid Lagoon, the only one I have. One up, nice colour, one down, lid on, clear the marker. Look how much paint was on that. Make sure it runs clean, which it is. And blend it out. Let it blend out really nicely. Lovely. Just give it a little dry bit that we can revisit. Oops, not with that side, we can't. Okay, lovely. Right, let's have a quick look at those. So that was the water brush pen, the old Pentel water brush pen, the Uhuhu brush tip marker, Spectrum Noir Aqua, the Tombow Dew tip, and the Distress marker. And obviously we'll revisit all these and once they've dried. But now we're going to move on to the fibre tip pens. So I'm calling this one the Fat Watercolour pen. It was the one that was labelled as watercolour pen. It's got a big bullet nib. One up, one down, or the other way around. Make sure the brush is running clear. It is. Blend it out. So as much as they have said that they are watercolour pens, it's not very watercolour effecty on that. What's next? Super tips. Did I not get a super tip out? I thought I did. Where is it? Oh, there it is, hiding behind the others. So now we're going to do a Crayola super tip. One up, one down. Oh, lids don't click on. Make sure the pen is running clear. Probably moves just as much as the one above it, which was sold as watercolour pens. Now we're going to do the Triplus Colour 323 by Staedtler. One down, one up, lid on. These lids are got them dead right. Make sure the pen runs clear. And blend. Oh, look at that, you can see the purple coming through. So that breaks down in a very unusual way. Bear in mind, none of these pens that I'm testing now are actually labelled as watercolour. They're just water-based fibre tip pens. Then we're going to do the Pentel Studio Arts one. One up, one down. Cleaning the brush off. Pens out. Just the same. Norris Club is next, which is by Staedtler. They're the Children's 326 series. So Tri Plus are 323, these are 326. These are the cheapest set of pens that I'm testing. Make sure the brush is clean. Blend it out. You can see they use exactly the same pigments as the Tri-Plus. I mean, they are by the same company, because they're both breaking down the same way with a purple undertone there. Interesting. And finally, we are going to look at, where's my flare? Papermate Flare. Oh, perhaps I shouldn't use that colour, because that one's not, that's a foam tip pen. We need one with a fibre tip like this. One up, one down. It's actually one down, one up, isn't it? But make sure that pen is clean. Blend it out. Wow, that breaks down amazingly well. Look at that. That turned into watercolour paint. So let us just put a blob a blob here, so we can come back to it when it's dry and see if it blends out. So when it's dry, super colour, super tips. Tri-Plus. Pentel. And Stadler Norris Club. And it really shows which ones have got a lot of pigment in it. And then the Papermate Flare. Okay, we'll revisit those after we've re-wet these ones. Okay, so round 2 is, once it's left to dry, will it still blend out? So this is the, I put water brush pen, but they're the watercolour, these things, the ones that are sold as watercolour brush pens. Okay. So it doesn't move quite so well once it's left to dry. Cleaning the brush off over here to the side, just here, not sure if you can see it, just to make sure that when we do the next one there's no pigment. So then this is the old Pentel Kuretake. Same, doesn't blend out quite as good as it did when it was wet, but it does blend out. Cleaning the brush. Next we're going to go to the brush marker. And when that's dry, it doesn't really blend out at all. It's just a bit of pigment movement off the top. Go to the Spectrum Noir Aqua. Which doesn't move. Does move, but a lot of the colour's soaked in the paper now, so it doesn't move as well. Go to the Tombow. Just know in the background I'm cleaning my marker pen, or my brush pen all the time. This is Tombow, which moves amazingly still. It just turns into watercolour. Doesn't leave a line. And then the Distress marker. Not so well. Okay, now we're going to revisit the non-brush pens, water-based pens. I have to turn my bit of paper over. Look, it's covered in blue. Okay. Fat watercolour pens, or the pens that are labelled watercolour. No, to get that to move anymore, I'm going to disintegrate the paper. Super tips. to be honest, no better or worse than the watercolour markers. In fact, probably slightly better than the watercolour markers at the top. Tri Plus. Again, just these are not sold as watercolour brushes, pens. They're sold as water-based markers. The ones that are labelled watercolour are the ones that I'm saying are labelled as watercolour. Pentel Art Studio. Nope, doesn't. Does it blend? No, it doesn't. Norris Club. It's gonna do the same as that one, isn't it? By Stedler. So these two sets of pens obviously use same ink, same pigments. And then the Flare. The Flare has a lot of pigment in it. I mean, obviously you can still see the line there, but there's a lot of pigment in it. Okay, you can see I have left a space. Why have I left a space? Well, one of the things that obviously I'm told all the time is, oh, you could use them, you could put them on a palette and just blend them out with water. So that's what we're going to do now. We're going to see how well all the water-based markers work when we do a bit of a scribble on a palette, blend it with water, and do it that way. So we'll start the clean brush and the water brush markers. There's a bit of the water brush. There's me picking it up, and there's me laying it down. Now, one of the things I always think that if I was going to do this, I'd just use watercolour paints, but obviously it does have a nice effect. So now we do the old Pentel, bit of it on the watercolour palette. Just going to change my tissue. Pick up the paint, brush it down. Lovely colour that, acts like watercolour. Hoo brush tips. Interesting, doesn't bead up quite the same as the two watercolour ones does. Don't know what that means. Don't know what chemical reaction causes that. There we go. Nice soft watercolour effect. Next, Spectrum Noir, Aqua. Big blob on there. Make sure my brush is clean. Grab the paint. Splodge it down. Very pigmented that. Very nice colour. Lots of pigment. Lovely stuff. Next is the Tombow. Grab the Tombow. Squidge it out. That's interesting. It does very similar to those two up there, where they sort of sat really on the surface. Grab the paint, blend it out. Beautiful colour, really pigmented. There we go. And finally, in this section, the distress marker. So, oops, don't want to use the fine end. Use the brush end. Similar effect to the way it sits on the surface. Grab the colour, blend it out. There we go. So they all act in exactly the same way when you put them on a palette and you scribble them with water. So if that's what you want to do with your markers, doesn't matter which ones you buy. Doesn't matter if they've got a brush tip or not. If you're going to put them on a palette, they'll all work that way. So now we need to do the same with the non-brush. So, fat watercolour markers. That's these kids. I'll zoom you in a little bit. The reason why I'm calling them watercolour is because that is what they are sold as. Watercolour markers. So, they sit on the surface of the pad. Very similar to the, is it the Pentel ones or the Uhu ones that did that? Yeah, not much pigment in them, to be honest, once you get them down. Super tips. Again, they don't break down quite the same. They sit on the pad more. Watercolouring with super tips. What's next? Try plus marker. Oops. Oh, that's the North Club. Okay, we'll do the North Club next. Thought it felt weird. Interesting, you can feel the colour breaking up. You can see the colour breaking up. It breaks up with purple and blue and just about every other. Look, there's blue and purple and green and everything in there. Let's go back and do the Tri Plus now. We're just going to do a very similar thing, I think. There's the Tri Plus. My brush is clean. Pick up the paint, ink, dye, pigment. Again, you can see the dye is just breaking up there. It's just blue and purple and everything. Water-based they may well be, but they are not watercolour. So, Pentel. Oh, what am I doing? You didn't tell me I wasn't supposed to be doing that. I was supposed to be doing this. Okay, so I'll have to put that somewhere else. Grab it off of there and put it just up here. Went onto autopilot. That blends out quite nicely. It maintains the integrity of the colour, unlike these Staedtler ones, which really don't. And finally, the Flare pen. Where's my Flare pen? I put it away, did I? Flare. There it is. The Flare pen. Oh, it's a really fine point pen. We'll get something down though. Clean the brush. Grab the paint. Oh, you can see it can breaking up. It's like a bluey black. Actually, really nice. Again, preserves the integrity of the colour. So, zoom you out so you can see the entire thing. Like this. And then we'll have a close-up look. So, up the top there we have watercolour paint. And you can see that that blends out all the way. Here we have a permanent waterproof ink pen. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put another bit in the middle there. And we'll come back to that when it's dry, because maybe it was a bit wet when we did it. But that was the control test to see how things reacted on this paper. Then we have this, which is the watercolour brush pens. Like I say, you can get them badged as various different companies. As a brush, on when they went down wet and was blended out wet, they didn't do too bad, but you can see the outline of what you've scribbled down. This was when it was dry, there's not much difference, and this was blended off a palette, which obviously when you look at all of these, all of them blend off a palette, because basically you're just putting the pigment down and then picking it back up. The two that I wouldn't recommend using for that are the two Staedtler ones, because the colour breaks down. The integrity of the ink or the dye or doesn't remain when you make it wet. The old Pentel, what used to be called watercolour brushes, lovely when they was wet, not so well when they was dry, brushed out lovely. Uhu markers, wet, dry, they didn't really blend out much at all, but again off the palette they look nice. The Spectrum Noir ones, quite disappointing actually. When they were wet they leave a big chunk, when they were dry they leave an even bigger line, but they blend out nicely off of a palette. Tombow markers, you can still see a bit of a shadow, a bit of a haze around where the colour was scribbled down. There it is again when it's dry, lovely when it's blended out. Distress marker, you can see, and then onto the fibre tip ones, which are, this one is actually sold as a watercolour pen, and you can see it really is just a water-based marker. In fact, the super tips, which are a lot cheaper, did better. Tri Plus, like I say, the integrity of the colour breaks down. The Pentel Arts, same as all the other fibre tip pens. Norris Club, and then the Flare pen, which really is a writing pen, if anything, did just as well as all the other ones. So the best one in my opinion is the Tombow. I think what I buy a watercolour brush for, pen for, is that I want to do a bit of colouring on something and then blend it out. If I was going to use the palette method, which they all worked brilliantly with, then I would use paints. The reason why I specifically want to use pens is because I want to colour, clean my brush, and then blend it out and make a watercolour effect from the pen. And I think the Tombows are excellent at that. A long time ago, when there was really not as many pens as there are on the market, there was really the Tombow and the real brush, the Zig real brush markers. And even compared to, I used to have the Zig real brush markers, and I got rid of them because these blended out so much better. So if you want a marker that you can use as a marker and blend it out, or put it down and blend it out, Tombows I think come a very first. Probably second. I mean, you probably can't get these ones anymore, but I probably wouldn't put them second anyway. They look very similar to the distress markers, so the distress markers probably are the close second. Then after that, it doesn't matter what you get. If you're gonna put them on a palette, you can buy the £4, well, maybe not the £4 ones, because the colour integrity was a bit rubbish on those. These were £6.99 for 30 pens, 40 pens. If you're going to put them on a palette, get your super tips. If you want a brush marker that blends out, get the Tombows. But there is a difference between watercolour, well, I say there is a difference between watercolour. There is a great deal of difference between watercolour pens and water-based pens. There's only about 2 or 3 different watercolour pens on the market that actually have pigment in them, actually watercolour pigments. So the Winsor & Newton pigment marker does, and a couple of others that I can't remember off the top of my head. But all these pens have just got dye in them. But some of them obviously have been made with a better ability to blend out. So are water-based pens and watercolour pens the same thing? It seems that a lot of companies are using the term watercolour when they mean water-based, because none of these are probably watercolour pens. Maybe these old ones are. These are all just water-based dye ink pens. So let's go back to this permanent ink up here, our control permanent ink. Oh, there you go. That's interesting. Anything moves when it's wet. Yeah, so that's it really. That's me comparing water-based and watercolour pens. And just a word of warning, I suppose, that don't, just because a company says it's a watercolour pen, it just probably means it's water-based. And even these water brush pens, which are labelled watercolour pens, they've probably got exactly the same in them as the super tips. They're just different brush heads on them. If you want a pen that really blends out, you know, you pay your money, it takes your choice, really. I really like the Tombow markers. So anyway, that's it. Thanks very much for watching. I have an awful lot of mess to clear up here. I have pens everywhere, all over my desk. And but it's been fun. Thanks very much for watching. Bye.